The fluorescent lights hummed their constant mechanical prayer above the pediatric ward at St. Michael's in Savannah, a sound most nurses stopped hearing after the first week. Laura Bennett hadn't stopped hearing it in 9 years. She moved through the corridors with the quiet precision of someone accustomed to high-stakes environments, though the other nurses only saw a competent colleague who kept to herself, shoulders slightly hunched as she charted, eyes focused on the monitors with an intensity that seemed excessive for a Tuesday evening shift. They didn't know. He didn't know either. Dr. Pierce, the attending physician whose expensive shoes clicked against the linoleum like a metronome counting down to something neither of them could predict. He saw a quiet nurse in pale blue scrubs, efficient but unremarkable, the kind of staff member who filled in gaps without drawing attention. What he didn't see was the way her hands never trembled during procedures, the muscle memory of someone who'd worked under fire. What he didn't see was the legend who'd held a trauma center for 14 hours while mortars fell outside the walls, who'd performed a field thoracotomy with a combat knife when the surgical kit ran out, whose hands had saved 14 lives in a single siege. Her identity was buried 7 layers deep under civilian credentials, Pentagon clearance, and a nursing license that was itself a cover for something larger. Laura's fingers traced the 4-line in 9-year-old Emma Hartley's arm with automatic gentleness, checking the catheter placement, the flow rate, the color of fluid in the drip chamber. The girl lay still on the hospital bed, staring at nothing, her small frame seeming to take up no space at all. The chart noted profound bilateral sensorineural hearing loss, confirmed by audiology at 14:30 hours that afternoon. Viral meningitis. The infection had moved through her inner ear like a ghost, destroying the delicate hair cells in the cochlea that transformed sound waves into signals the brain could understand. The attending physicians had written their conclusions in language that sounded final, permanent hearing loss. Prognosis poor. Consider cochlear implant evaluation at 6 months post-diagnosis. But that wasn't what made Laura pause. The framed photograph on the bedside table showed a man in dress uniform, face weathered by sun and altitude, eyes that carried the particular clarity of someone who'd seen exactly what humans were capable of. Colonel James Hartley, the nameplate read. Green Beret. Currently deployed to Bagram Airfield, Parwan Province, Afghanistan. Laura recognized him instantly, not from intelligence briefings or unit rosters, but from 17 years of searching military photographs every morning, looking for the face of the man who had kept her son Marcus alive through 3 tours. The commanding officer who'd pulled him out of a burning Humvee in Sanjan Valley. The CO who'd written the letter that came back in Marcus's footlocker, "Your son saved 3 Marines today. He'll come home. I'll make sure of it." She'd kept that letter in the same drawer where the folded flag now lived. The flag was the size of a closed fist when folded into its triangle, the corners creased so precisely they could cut skin. It had come from Sergeant Daniel Reeves's casket, Danny, who'd been Laura's battle buddy for 6 years, who'd taught her how to splint a femur with nothing but a magazine and electrical tape, who'd held her hand when they both realized the blood bank was empty and the supply helicopter wasn't coming. The Sinaloa cartel had diverted the medical shipment somewhere in the Pakistani supply chain. 12 units of O-negative blood never reached their field hospital. Danny bled out on the operating table while Laura's hand stayed steady and her mind calculated the next priority, the Marine behind him who was still alive, still savable. The flag sat in her locker now, folded at the bottom, beneath the civilian clothes she wore to a life that wasn't hers. Laura checked Emma's monitors one more time, oxygen saturation at 96%, heart rate steady at 78, blood pressure normal for a 9-year-old. The child's hearing aids sat on the bedside table, expensive programmable devices that would do nothing for sensorineural loss this profound. The girl wasn't wearing them. There was a hollow quality to her stillness, the particular isolation of someone who'd just lost an entire sense of the world. "How is she doing?" The voice came from the doorway, not the girl's mother, who'd gone to get coffee 40 minutes ago, but Dr. Nathaniel Pierce, head of pediatrics, his face arranged in the expression of someone performing concern for an audience that wasn't present. His charcoal suit probably cost more than Laura's monthly rent. He carried a tablet, and his eyes moved across the monitor readings with the speed of someone checking a box. "Vital stable," Laura said quietly. "She's resting. Chart shows audiology confirmed permanent loss this afternoon. 14:30 hours. Bilateral, severe to profound. Pierce nodded, made a note on his tablet with a stylus that looked like it cost more than a used car. We've got experimental protocols we can discuss with the parents. New modalities. Things standard audiology won't recommend yet. He looked at Emma with the clinical distance of someone assessing inventory. Insurance will cover most of it. Colonel Hartley's military benefits are quite comprehensive. Something in the way he said it made Laura's shoulders tighten. It was the tone of someone calculating value, not the tone of someone considering a child suffering. What experimental protocols? Laura kept her voice level, deferential, the tone of a junior nurse asking clarifying questions about an attending's plan. Pharmaceutical interventions. Cellular regeneration research. Still in phase 2 trials, technically, but I've got connections at the supplier, we can access them through an expedited compassionate use pathway. He tapped the tablet again. I'll get her started on the initial compound tomorrow morning. Should see measurable response within 5 days. Laura said nothing. She'd learned 9 years ago that the best questions were the ones she asked silently, the ones she documented in her precise charting while her face showed nothing but professional attention. Her eye scanned his notes on the tablet screen as he turned it slightly. Treatment plan dated 1848, 2 hours before audiology's testing, before the diagnosis was even confirmed. The pharmaceutical name was something that sounded legitimate but read like gibberish to civilian ears. 3 times daily for 10 days. Any concerns, Nurse Bennett? Pierce's voice had taken on an edge, the particular tone of someone who didn't appreciate being scrutinized. No, Doctor. She stepped back, angling her body away from him, making herself smaller. 19 years of being underestimated taught you how to do that, how to make yourself invisible while keeping everything visible. I'll monitor the baseline vitals closely. See that you do. He turned to leave, then paused. And perhaps we don't need to document every detail of the treatment protocol. Paperwork gets so complicated with investigational compounds. The parents have enough stress without FDA forms clogging the chart. He left before she could respond. Laura stood in the doorway of Emma's room and listened to his footsteps move down the hallway, click, 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 the sound of expensive shoes on linoleum moving away from her, moving toward another patient, another chart, another opportunity. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, unchanged, indifferent. She looked back at Emma, small and still in the hospital bed, and then at the photograph on the bedside table. Colonel James Hartley's face stared forward with the clarity of someone accustomed to impossible situations. In her locker, in the bottom drawer beneath the folded flag, sat her nursing credential. Above that, a second credential, one she'd never shown another nurse at St. Michael's. One she'd show to very few people, ever. The title read Captain Laura Bennett, United States Army Medical Corps, and beneath that, a different kind of authorization, Pentagon Investigative Authority, Medical Fraud Division, approved for classified operations on civilian soil. She'd been sent to St. Michael's 6 months ago because a pattern had emerged in the data. Military families being treated here. Documented interventions in the charts. Treatments that showed up on insurance claims. Treatments that, when investigated by pharmacy, had never actually been dispensed. The money was moving, the documentation was perfect, and someone in the building was making it work with surgical precision. She just hadn't known yet who. Now she did. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have predicted, was that this case would bring back Bagram in ways she wasn't prepared for. That looking at Colonel Hartley's photograph would take her back to the field hospital, back to the moment Danny's heart stopped, back to the knowledge that corruption in supply chains killed as surely as any bullet. That a deaf 9-year-old girl was about to become the epicenter of something much larger than either of them understood. Laura walked to the break room, moving through the quiet corridors of the pediatric ward at 21:56 hours on a Tuesday evening. She poured herself a cup of coffee that had been sitting since the day's shift ended, the kind of coffee that tasted like burnt regret. The other nurses who worked the evening shift were scattered elsewhere, probably charting in their stations, taking their breaks separately, the way they always did when Laura entered a room. She'd long since stopped caring about the silence that followed her into spaces. Back in her locker, she opened the bottom drawer and placed her hand on the folded flag, the small triangle of fabric that held the weight of everything that had brought her to this moment. The grief was data. The loss was information. The reason Colonel Hartley's daughter lay in that hospital bed, deaf and vulnerable, might be connected to the same supply corruption that had killed her friend. She'd learned long ago that the world wasn't random, it was a system of cause and effect, action and consequence, and somewhere in the gaps between the medical records and the pharmacy logs, the truth was waiting to be documented. One name. One pattern. One chart at a time. She closed the locker quietly and returned to the pediatric ward, where Emma Hartley slept in the pale glow of monitors, and where Dr. Pierce's expensive shoes had left no footprints at all. Morning rounds at St. Michael's began at 7 o'clock sharp, the way Dr. Pierce preferred, punctual, controlled, with an audience. Laura stood at the medication cart outside Emma's room, watching through the doorway as he entered with 4 residents trailing behind him like remoras following a shark. The fluorescent lights cast everything in the same sickly pallor, but Pierce had the kind of presence that made the air pressure change, the way a storm front moves through a room before anyone feels the first drop of rain. Amanda Hartley sat in the bedside chair, her hand resting on Emma's shoulder. The girl was awake, her eyes tracking toward the voices but hearing nothing, the silence inside her head absolute and impenetrable. Colonel James Hartley's photograph sat on the nightstand in dress blues, the man who'd kept Laura's son alive through 3 tours in the Hindu Kush, the man whose voice Emma would likely never hear again. Pierce pulled the chart from the foot of the bed with theatrical precision. He reviewed the pages, his jaw tightening as he scanned Laura's nursing notes. The notations were meticulous, timestamps, vital sign correlations, medication reconciliations, every entry signed with her initials and the date. Protocol. Nothing more. Nothing less. He looked up from the chart and his eyes found Laura across the room. That thin smile appeared, the one that didn't reach his eyes. Nurse Bennett has been noting, repeatedly, concerns about our treatment protocol, Pierce announced, his voice pitched for the residents' benefit. Tell me, Nurse Bennett, where did you complete your medical degree? The residents exchanged glances. One of them, a third-year named Chen, actually snickered. Laura's face remained absolutely still. Her stare was flat and cold, the way it had been when she'd held pressure on a sucking chest wound while rounds fired overhead in Cuna Province. She'd learned long ago that flinching was a luxury soldiers couldn't afford, and old habits lived in her muscle memory like shrapnel. I'm following standard nursing documentation procedures, Doctor. Her voice was measured, quiet, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Pierce set the chart down on the bed rail and turned to Amanda, his posture shifting into something almost paternal. The performance was immaculate. Laura recognized the technique, isolate the decision-maker, undermine the rival, control the narrative. Mrs. Hartley, I want you to understand that Nurse Bennett's outdated protocols are why this child isn't improving. Her resistance to modern pharmaceutical intervention is, quite frankly, why your daughter remains deaf. The words landed like shrapnel. Laura watched Amanda's face crumple, watched the mother's hand tighten on Emma's shoulder, watched the hope drain out of a woman who'd already lost so much. Emma didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. Children always did. The girl's fingers curled into her mother's sleeve. Some nurses never advance beyond their limited training, Pierce continued, moving closer to the chart. They become obstacles to actual medicine. Resistance to progress. Frankly, it's negligent. He extracted a yellow form from his clipboard, already prepared, already filled out, and handed it to Laura without looking at her. His fingers were manicured, the nails clean, the hands of someone who'd never had to use them for anything that mattered. The opposite of Laura's hands, which carried the map of every wound she'd ever sutured, every life she'd ever held together in the dark. You're being written up for insubordination. This will be posted on the unit disciplinary board so all staff can learn from your example. The room was so quiet you could hear the ventilator's mechanical breath. Laura took the form without comment. She folded it once, then slipped it into her pocket. Her jaw was set, but it wasn't fear that made the muscles tight. It was restraint. The trembling wasn't panic, it was the body's way of containing something that wanted very badly to be released. The residents followed Pierce out of the room like ducklings. Within 30 seconds, the only sound left was Emma's monitor, its gentle rhythm counting the seconds like a metronome. Laura checked the girl's foresight, adjusted the saline bag, made a note in the chart. Her hands moved with absolute precision, muscle memory taking over. She'd done this 1,000 times before, in 100 different rooms, while the world outside burned. The break room at 8:15 was where the unit's social hierarchy crystallized. Nurses clustered in groups, the 12-year veterans near the coffee station, the med-surg crowd by the window, the new grads hovering uncertainly near the refrigerator. Laura poured a cup of black coffee, nothing added, and moved toward an empty chair at a corner table. The temperature in the room didn't drop, it plummeted. For nurses at the adjacent table looked at each other in sequence, a silent communication that required no words. Sarah Chen gathered her empty yogurt cup. Martinez stood and stretched. Williams capped her coffee. Petal followed. Within 90 seconds, the entire cluster had dispersed, their chairs pushed back with deliberate slowness, their exit coordinated like a choreographed retreat. They didn't run. They didn't make it obvious. They simply left, one by one, until Laura sat alone with her coffee cooling in a room that suddenly felt 10 degrees colder. A new grad named Sarah remained at the far end of the break room, sorting through her bag. She wouldn't meet Laura's eyes. Nobody met her eyes anymore. Pierce had accomplished what he'd intended, he'd isolated her, marked her as a problem, made her contagious. One wrong word from the attending and the entire unit became untouchable. Laura understood the calculus. She'd seen it before in military hierarchies, in clinics where the wrong reputation could cost you your career, your clearance, your entire identity. That afternoon, at 2 o'clock, Pierce found her by the medication cart. He moved with the confidence of a man accustomed to being the most important person in any room, his white coat pressed and perfect, his badge clipped at exactly the right angle. "We need to talk about this chart situation," he said, his voice low and sharp, aimed at her alone. "Your excessive documentation is creating problems. Every question you note makes the family doubt my clinical judgment. You're undermining treatment protocols with your outdated concerns." Laura didn't stop working. She continued pulling medications from the automated dispensary, checking doses against the computer screen, her movements economical and precise. The family has a right to understand what's being administered to their daughter. "The family trusts me to know what's best for their child," Pierce said. His hand gripped the cart's edge, his knuckles whitening. "You will stop noting these supposed discrepancies, or you will find yourself unemployed. Do you understand me, Florence?" He'd called her by her first name. Not her last. Not Nurse Bennett. The diminishment was intentional, the kind of small cruelty that worked on people who cared what others thought of them. Laura finished pulling the 0.5 milligrams dose of lorazepam and turned to face him fully. Her stare was absolutely level, her eyes the color of a stormy Atlantic. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who'd made decisions that meant life or death, who'd held the line when everything else had collapsed. The voice of a captain addressing someone who'd just failed to understand the seriousness of the situation. History will remember which of us actually cared whether that child heard her father's voice again. She turned away from the cart and walked down the hallway, her footsteps steady and unhurried on the tile floor. Behind her, she heard Pierce's breath catch, heard the sound of him pulling his phone from his pocket, heard the rapid typing begin. He was documenting this moment, creating his paper trail, building the case that would eventually cost her everything. She didn't look back. The locker door was cool against her palm when she opened it later that shift. The folded flag was still there, tucked behind the spare stethoscope, red, white, and blue, pressed into a tight triangle the way the funeral detail had done it at Danny's ceremony. Her teammate. Her friend. The one who died because blood products hadn't reached the field hospital outside Bagram in time, because supply corruption had made sure the right equipment took the wrong routes. That wasn't the worst part, though. The worst part was knowing that the same corruption might be happening here, in this hospital, in this moment, while a 9-year-old girl lay in a bed unable to hear and a mother was losing faith that anyone actually knew how to help her. Laura folded her hands around the flag and held it in the darkness of the locker, letting the weight of it settle against her palms. Somewhere in the hospital, Dr. Pierce was making phone calls. Somewhere in Savannah, a Green Beret colonel was conducting Operation 7,000 miles away, unaware that his daughter's life was being decided in a room with bad lighting and worse intentions. And Laura Bennett, decorated combat medic, covert Pentagon investigator, was being systematically erased from the only place where it mattered, the bedside of a child who needed someone who actually knew how to save her life. The shift ended at 8 o'clock. Laura clocked out, changed into civilian clothes, and walked through the parking lot toward her truck. The evening air was humid, thick with the smell of asphalt and approaching rain. Her phone buzzed once. A text from an encrypted line, evidence package updated. Proceed as planned. She didn't respond. She just drove home through streets that all looked the same, her hand steady on the wheel at exactly the speed limit, thinking about history and who got to write it. And that's when everything changed. 2:02 in the morning. The fluorescent hum of Emma's room felt different at that hour, thinner, more honest. Laura stood at the medication cart, hands moving with the precision that made other nurses uncomfortable. They said she was methodical. They meant she noticed things. The line running into Emma's small arm caught the light wrong. Not the angle. The color of her skin around the insertion site. A faint bluish tint creeping past the tape at her lips. Cyanosis. Subtle. Early. The kind of thing a tired day shift nurse might miss at shift change. Laura pulled the chart. 2:02 a.m. The medication log showed a new entry at 2200 hours signed by Dr. Pierce himself. A pharmaceutical designation she recognized immediately, experimental, expensive, not yet approved for pediatric use. Flagged in the FDA database as carrying significant cardiovascular interactions. The notation read, administered and tolerated well. Except Emma had been sleeping for the past 3 hours. Laura had been watching her. No nurse had entered this room since 21:30. No medication had been administered. She checked the antivirals running on the second pump. The interaction was textbook catastrophic. The drug Pierce documented was a platelet aggregation inhibitor. Emma's antivirals were membrane destabilizers. Combined, they created a cascade, blood pressure drop, coronary steal phenomenon, myocardial hypoxia. Not immediately. Quietly. The kind of death that looks like sudden failure when it was actually orchestrated over hours by a man who needed this chart to show he had tried everything before she failed. Emma's monitor showed it first. A rhythm change. Subtle. Then the alarm. Not screaming, that came later. A soft persistent beeping that meant nothing was wrong until everything was catastrophically wrong. Laura moved before conscious thought. Her hands didn't call for help. They called for muscle memory from a forward surgical team at Bagram Air Base, from 17 months of watching soldiers bleed out on plastic stretchers, from the night she and Captain Danny Torres held a 17-year-old from Kandahar province together as his lungs filled with fluid from a ruptured spleen. Emma's skin was grey now. The monitor showed a line that belonged in a flatline screen, not a 9-year-old child. Laura's fingers found the landmarks on the small chest. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The needle was a 14 gauge from the crash cart that would arrive in approximately 90 seconds. She didn't have 90 seconds. She had the needle from her trauma shears case. The shears themselves were engraved on the handle with a call sign she wasn't supposed to carry anymore. The needle was old. It would work. The hiss of air escaping was the sound of Emma Hartley still living. Laura's voice was conversational. She's in tension pneumothorax. Get me a manual ventilation bag and an 8mm endotracheal tube. Not a request. The words had the weight of someone who had issued orders under fire. The resident who appeared in the doorway froze. Laura didn't look at him. Her hands were already moving. Removing the oxygen mask. Opening Emma's airway. The tube slid in with the kind of fluid precision that only came from training in field conditions, where your error margin was measured in seconds and the patient bled out if you hesitated. Bagging started. 1 compression. 2. The resident had found his voice now. Calling the code. The intercom crackled above the mechanical whoosh of the ventilation bag. Laura maintained the rhythm. Not fast. Not panicked. The rhythm of someone who had done this when the room was shaking from artillery fire, when the lighting came from kerosene lamps, when success meant the patient lived long enough to reach the next level of care. 14 minutes. That was the timeline the code team would later reference. 14 minutes of manual ventilation because a 9-year-old child's lungs needed oxygen and her heart needed time to stabilize, and the person holding the ventilation bag had done this exact procedure in worse conditions with less equipment and infinitely higher personal risk. The code team arrived in their standard formation. Attending, 2 residents, respiratory, nursing staff. They flowed around Laura like water around a stone. She didn't resist the transition. Protocol demanded she step back. She did, still watching Emma's face, still listening to the monitor as they transitioned to mechanical ventilation, as they ran the algorithms, as they loaded epinephrine and atropine and the medications that belonged in critical care. Emma's sinus rhythm returned at minute 16. Steady. Climbing. The color returned to her face in stages. Pink at the ears first. Then the lips. Then the skin below her cyanotic lines began to normalize. When Amanda Hartley ran into the room in her hospital gown, still trailing her for line, Laura was standing against the far wall, her hands at her sides, her expression the kind of flat calm that registered as nothing to people who didn't know what they were looking at. What they were looking at was a woman breathing through the weight of having just saved her assigned patient using procedures that required either a medical emergency exception or a medical license she wasn't supposed to be using in this civilian capacity. Pierce arrived 12 minutes later. He stood in the doorway watching the code team conduct their standard post-crisis assessment. His eyes found Laura. They locked for exactly 3 seconds. Then his jaw moved the way it did when he was calculating. Building. Constructing the architecture that would explain what happened here as something that needed to be documented as a breach rather than a miracle. He didn't speak to Laura. He turned and walked to the nurse's station where the shift supervisor was still processing the shock. Laura watched him lean close to her ear. Watched the supervisor's eyes widen. Watched Pierce slide a piece of paper across the counter with a kind of casual confidence that meant it was already written. Already signed. Already ready to become official. The paperwork found her at the medication cart at 06:30. An incident report. Incident report 7734, C. Allegation, performance of invasive procedures outside scope of nursing practice. Regulatory citation, Hospital Policy 3.7.2, restriction of invasive interventions. The document read like something that had been composed with medical legal precision. It detailed her actions. It quoted the policy verbatim. It explained that needle decompression, emergency intubation, and manual ventilation constituted physician-level interventions and that her performance of these procedures without direct physician supervision violated hospital protocol regardless of patient outcome. Regardless of patient outcome. The word sat on the page like a threat. Like the defining sentence of a termination case. Because outcomes didn't matter if the procedures were technically outside scope. The patient living didn't matter if she had violated policy. The little girl breathing didn't matter if the mechanism violated hospital hierarchy. Pierce had constructed something elegant. Something legally airtight. Something that took a life-saving action and reframed it as insubordination. Laura read the document once. She didn't fold it. She didn't crease it or grip it hard enough to leave fingerprints. She simply held it at her sides and looked at Dr. Pierce across the nurse's station. He was watching her with the expression of a man who had set a trap and was waiting to see if she would thrash against it. She didn't say anything. That was the choice she made in that moment. Not because she had nothing to say. Because the words she had were the kind that would burn every bridge, reveal every layer, detonate the Pentagon investigation across 4 states. She couldn't defend herself without explaining why a covert operative had been embedded in his unit. She couldn't explain the embedded operative without explaining that his billing practices had triggered federal scrutiny. She couldn't explain federal scrutiny without compromising operatives at 11 other facilities. So she said nothing. Pierce smiled. The smile of a man who interpreted silence as fear. Who thought he had won. Who believed that what had just happened, what he was about to make official, was the beginning of her unraveling. He pulled out his phone. She watched him type. She knew who he was calling. The nursing director. The credentials committee. The hospital administrator. Not to report an incident. To lay the foundation for a termination case that would be constructed over the next 72 hours with the precision of a military operation. And that's when the next page arrived. Then the next. A supplementary incident report dated minutes after the first. A pattern analysis referencing 6 months of documented insubordination. A behavioral assessment suggesting a hostile work environment created by excessive documentation. A chain of command violation summary. Each page copied to 3 different departments. Each form more elaborate than the last. Each one another brick in the wall that Pierce was building. Laura went to Emma's room instead of leaving her shift. The girl was sleeping, her small chest rising and falling to the rhythm of the ventilator. Amanda Hartley was asleep in the chair beside her, her face carrying the kind of exhaustion that only came from watching your child die and then watching them live again. Laura didn't speak. She just stood there and made a decision. The Pentagon investigation was important. The 4 states of military medical fraud mattered. The supply corruption that had killed her battle buddy Danny and 37 others like him, that mattered. But this moment, right now, this child's breath and this mother's vigil and this man's calculation that he could weaponize protocol against heroism, this mattered more than protocol. More than procedure. More than protecting an operation. She reached into her pocket and touched the folded flag she kept there. The one from Danny's casket. The one that smelled like diesel fuel and Afghanistan dust. And she made the call. The phone rang in a building in Arlington, Virginia. The voice on the other end had a call sign, not a name. Angel 6. It's Nightingale 6. The operation just became hostile. I need extraction. 72 hours. That's how long Dr. Pierce spent building his documentation trail, each supplementary incident report methodically constructed like a fortress wall. He filed them in sequence, timed them carefully, created a paper chain that wound through the hospital's compliance system like a noose tightening. Every single form cited Laura's pattern of dangerous behavior, her refusal to acknowledge physician authority, her unauthorized procedures outside the scope of nursing practice. He knew exactly what he was doing. This wasn't panic. This was a man who had orchestrated institutional destruction before, and he was doing it with the precision of someone who understood that bureaucracy moved slower than courts, but infinitely more certain. Each report fed the next. The first cited the incident with Emma. The second claimed Laura had accessed restricted medication logs without authorization. The third, filed at 2:27 a.m. on day 3, alleged she had made threatening statements to hospital staff, a vague accusation, but documented nonetheless. Pierce had called his pharmaceutical contact on day 2. The problem will be resolved by Thursday morning, he'd said into his encrypted phone. Termination letter is already drafted. Once she's gone, the paper trail dies with her. He didn't know that Laura had already documented everything. Every falsified treatment date. Every insurance claim that preceded actual diagnoses. Every kickback deposit into an offshore account under a medical supply company's name. He didn't know that her meticulous charting, the same charting he'd mocked during rounds, had been automatically forwarded to a secured Pentagon server every night at midnight, encrypted and timestamped, building an unbreakable evidence file that made his documentation trail look like a child's drawing. But Laura knew something else. She couldn't defend herself without exposing the investigation. That was the trap. That was the thing that sat in her chest like a stone as she waited for the phone call that came at 05 for 5 hours on Thursday morning. Patricia Vance's voice, clipped and professional. Bennett. My office. 6 o'clock. The hospital at dawn is a different place than it is at noon. The fluorescent lights buzz softer. The corridors are emptier. Footsteps echo differently on the linoleum. Laura walked through that quiet with her shoulders straight, the termination letter already waiting like a fait accompli on Vance's desk. She could feel it before she saw it, the weight of inevitable things. Vance looked genuinely uncomfortable. Administrator Patricia Vance, 3 stars on her shoulder from the National Guard, who had been a field surgeon herself before she moved into administration. She gestured to the chair across from her desk. Sit down, Captain. Laura didn't sit. Vance slid the letter across the mahogany surface. White envelope, official seal, the kind of thing that ended careers. The documentation is overwhelming, Vance said quietly. Dr. Pierce has built what appears to be an airtight case. Policy violations. Unauthorized procedures. I've reviewed every form myself. The board is unanimous. Laura picked up the letter. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. The words were already familiar, effective immediately, citation of incident report, pattern of behavior incompatible with hospital standards, final paycheck mailed within 10 business days. I'm sorry, Vance said. She meant it. That much was genuine. Laura folded the letter once. Then again. Her hands moved with the mechanical precision of someone who had done this before, packed field kits, rolled equipment, prepared for extraction. Thank you, Administrator. She was already walking toward the door when Vance called out, for what it's worth, I believe you're a good nurse. Laura paused at the threshold. Her voice, when it came, was steady as a surgical laser. Belief doesn't matter when someone controls the paperwork. The locker room was empty. 6 in the morning, the day shift still 20 minutes away. Laura pulled off her scrubs, pale blue, faded from 100 washes, the fabric soft and familiar against her skin. She folded them methodically, the same way she folded everything. 1 long fold. 2. 3. Creases precise as a knife edge. Then she opened the lower shelf of her locker and retrieved the flag. 17 by 8 inches. Cotton. Folded into the precise triangle that honor guards fold them, the way they're folded over caskets at Arlington. It was the flag from Danny Rodriguez's casket. Danny, who had been her EMT before he was her teammate. Danny, who died because the blood supply contamination at Bagram meant the field hospital had nothing to transfuse him with when he came in with a penetrating abdominal wound at 3 in the morning. The corruption that Pierce and his network were still profiting from, still operating, still killing people. She set the flag down next to the folded scrubs. Blue and white beside pale blue. A flag beside cloth that represented the only place where she'd been allowed to be what she actually was. Sarah Chen, the new grad nurse, appeared in the doorway. 19 hours into her first shift rotation and already reading the room with the intuition that made her dangerous someday. This isn't right, Laura, Sarah said. Everyone knows you saved that girl. The nurses on the floor are talking. Half the ER staff is saying Pierce invented half those reports. Laura closed her locker with a soft click. Right and wrong don't matter when someone controls the paperwork. She grabbed the cardboard box she'd brought that morning, the one that was supposed to stay empty for at least 5 more years. Personal items. A photo of Marcus in his ROTC uniform. The pen from the Kandahar Field Hospital. A coffee mug that read "The nurses do it with patience." Things that had no business being in this box. She was loading the folded flag carefully, respectfully, when Amanda Hartley appeared in the doorway. Emma's mother. The woman whose daughter was supposed to regain her hearing through Dr. Pierce's innovative treatment protocols that had never existed, equipment that had never been purchased, files that had been backdated to look legitimate. Amanda's face was stricken. They're saying you're fired because of Emma. Dr. Pierce told me you endangered her life. That you performed procedures you weren't trained for. That you put our daughter at risk. Every word was a hammer blow. Every word was also calculated. Pierce would have ceded those statements, let them drift to Amanda like gospel. Of course he would. Of course. Laura set down the box. She turned to face Emma's mother, and her eyes held the kind of clarity that comes from having already decided what you're willing to lose. Mrs. Hartley, I would recommend you request a full audit of your daughter's treatment billing records. Request an independent ENT consultation from someone outside Dr. Pierce's network. Someone from Atlanta or Jacksonville. Let them review her hearing prognosis independently. That's all I can say. Amanda looked confused. Suspicious. Desperate. Your daughter's recovery was never going to come from what Dr. Pierce was giving her, Laura continued, her voice dropping. That's all the information I can provide you with right now. I'm sorry. She picked up the box and walked past her, toward the exit, toward the morning that was already breaking over Savannah in shades of grey and amber. The parking lot stretched ahead of her, the kind of empty expanse that exists between one life and another, between the person you pretend to be and the person you actually are. Behind her, back in his office on the 4th floor, Dr. Pierce watched her leave. The small smile on his face was the smile of a man who believed he had won. He pulled out his encrypted phone and composed a message to his pharmaceutical contact. The documentation problem has been resolved. She's terminated, effective immediately. The paper trail ends today. He didn't see the security camera that had been recording his office conversations for the past 6 weeks. He didn't know about the 3 FBI agents who were currently reviewing the files Laura had compiled, the evidence so overwhelming it would take federal prosecutors exactly 90 minutes to draft the indictment. He didn't know that his pharmaceutical supplier had already turned evidence against him in exchange for immunity. He only knew that the nurse who had made him feel powerless was gone. Laura reached her car, a silver Honda Civic, anonymous and forgettable, the kind of vehicle that could disappear into traffic. She was loading the box into the back seat when she heard them. Boots on pavement. Distinctive rhythm. Military dress shoes striking the asphalt in that deliberate cadence that only comes from drill instruction. Her body recognized it before her mind did, went rigid with something between panic and recognition. Marcus appeared around the corner of the parking structure, and he was in dress uniform. Dark blue jacket, pressed until the creases looked like geometry. Medals on his chest, not his medals, her medals. And he was carrying something that made Laura's entire tactical composure fracture for the first time in 3 days. A shadow box. Mahogany frame. Glass front. And inside, arranged with the ceremonial precision that only a military family would use, her silver star. Her bronze star with Valor. Her combat medical badge. The 3 pieces of metal that represented everything she had buried, everything she had hidden, everything she had sacrificed to stay invisible. "Mom, they need to see these," Marcus said. Not whispered. Said. Loud enough that 3 nurses heading into the building stopped and turned. Loud enough that the morning shift began flowing out the doors like a tide. "Marcus, no," Laura said, and her voice cracked. Cracked. After everything, after 3 days of perfect composure, her voice broke like old concrete. But her son was already opening the case. The morning sun caught the metal, threw light back at her, and for a moment the parking lot became still. Absolutely still. The sound of footsteps stopping. Murmurs. Phone cameras emerging. Amanda Hartley pushed to the front of the gathering crowd, and her eyes moved from the medals to Laura's face, and something shifted in her expression. Recognition. Not the kind that comes from being told, but the kind that comes from understanding. Her voice was barely above a whisper, "Nightingale 6. You're Nightingale 6. The nurse who held the trauma center during the siege at Bagram." The words hung in the parking lot air like something radioactive. Marcus pulled out the citation document. His voice was steady and clear, and so loud that Dr. Pierce, 3 floors above, felt something cold run down his spine even though he didn't yet know why. The President of the United States takes pleasure in presenting the Silver Star to Captain Laura Bennett, United States Army Nurse Corps. Everything changed in that instant. Not because anyone had thrown a punch. Not because anyone had yelled. But because the quietest person in the parking lot had finally stopped being quiet, and the silence that followed was the kind of silence that ends things. Marcus arrived in dress uniform at 6:17 in the morning, when the pediatric ward was still moving at half speed, when the night shift had clocked out and day shift was still brewing their second coffee. He carried a shadow box the size of a briefcase, walked straight through the staff in trance like he'd been there 100 times before, and found his mother in the supply closet on the 3rd floor where she was returning linens. He didn't ask permission. He didn't soften his voice. "Mom, they need to see these." His words carried the tone of a command, the kind of tone she'd trained into him, and loud enough that 3 nurses stopped moving. Loud enough that Sarah, the new graduate, stuck her head around the corner to look. Loud enough that by the time Marcus walked toward the main corridor, people were following. The morning shift gathered without being summoned. They moved like gravity was pulling them, like something in the air had shifted and nobody wanted to be the person who missed it. Marcus set the shadow box on the medication counter and opened it without ceremony. No speeches. No build-up. Just the flat click of the lid, and there was Laura's history lying open like a diagnosis. Silver Star. Bronze Star with Valor. Combat Medical Badge. Each one caught the fluorescent lights differently, each one catching the edges of the medals like they were still catching muzzle flash. The ribbons were faded the way real ribbons fade, not from storage but from wearing, from the kind of wearing that happens when you're moving through places where the air pressure changes with every footstep. Amanda Hartley stood 3 people back from the counter, and something in her face shifted like a door opening. Her hand went to her mouth. "Nightingale 6, she whispered, the words coming out like she'd just recognized someone she thought was dead. "That's your call sign. You're the nurse who held the trauma center during the siege." She pulled out her phone with shaking hands and scrolled to something she'd saved, something she must have read 1,000 times. The citation. Official military language, the kind of writing that moves through you like a current because every word has been tested against the weight of what it describes. Her voice when she read was quiet enough that everyone leaned in. Captain Laura Bennett demonstrated extraordinary heroism under fire, saving 14 lives when her hospital came under direct attack. Despite injuries sustained from shrapnel, she maintained triage operations, performed emergency field thoracotomy with a combat knife when instruments became unavailable, and refused evacuation until all wounded personnel were transported to safety. Her actions under extreme duress exemplified the highest standards of military medicine and human courage. The room went dead silent. Not the kind of silence that comes from shock. The kind of silence that comes from understanding that everything they'd just seen was real, that every rejection in the break room, every write-up, every time Laura had accepted humiliation without flinching, all of it had been deliberate. All of it had been control. The medication cart squeaked. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3. Dr. Pierce pushed through the gathering crowd, his face the color of a burn, his voice carrying the particular venom of a man watching his future collapse in real time. "This is a fabrication to save her job. That woman was fired for violating protocol, for performing procedures outside her scope of practice. Those medals are fabricated or stolen or," he didn't finish because Hospital Administrator General Patricia Vance stepped forward from the back of the crowd, and she moved like someone who had spent 43 years commanding rooms. She didn't speak louder than Pierce. She spoke with the kind of precision that made volume irrelevant. Vance rendered a slow salute to the shadow box, a movement that turned her entire body into a statement, and when her hand dropped, her eyes locked onto Pierce's like a targeting system. "Captain Bennett's Pentagon clearance just came through my secure line," Vance said. "She's been investigating you for 6 months. The Department of Defense Inspector General has documented $18,000 in kickbacks from MedSource Supply. $43,000 in fraudulent pharmaceutical charges on Emma Hartley's account alone. You delayed necessary cochlear evaluation 3 times to continue billing treatments you never administered." She opened a folder she'd been holding at her side. Your hospital privileges are suspended effective immediately. You're being reported to the Georgia Medical Board, and federal charges are likely within the month. Pierce's hand went to his throat like he couldn't get air. His lawyer, a woman in a navy suit who'd suddenly appeared, started saying something about representation and due process, but Vance was already walking away, toward Laura, and the gesture meant something that words couldn't touch. She nodded once, a movement that carried the weight of everything: recognition, apology, respect, and that was when Laura understood that the woman had known the entire time. That Vance had watched her be humiliated, had allowed it to happen, because it was the only way to build a case that would stick. By noon, the video was everywhere. Someone had recorded Pierce during rounds, had captured the moment he called her Florence in front of Emma, had filmed the exact angle of his sneer when the medals appeared. For million views by afternoon. The clip was soundtracked with military march music, titled "Doctor Humiliates Silver Star Nurse, Then the Truth Comes Out." By 1400, it reached Dr. Robert Chen at Johns Hopkins Medical Center, the physician who'd written Pierce's medical school recommendation, who'd championed his residency, whose mentorship had launched Pierce's entire career. Chen watched the entire video while standing in his office, and then he made one phone call. His words were precise. His words were final. "I am formally withdrawing my professional endorsement of Dr. Marcus Pierce. The physician in that video does not represent the values I thought I was cultivating. I was wrong about him." The board convened at 1600. Pierce arrived confident, carrying his documentation like armor, but he didn't understand that armor only works if nobody's already seen inside. Dr. Okafor, the board chairman, opened a folder and didn't let him interrupt. Didn't let him explain. Just read the evidence like it was a diagnosis Pierce couldn't argue with. "You billed for 6 experimental interventions totaling $43,000. None were administered. You received $18,000 in kickbacks. You delayed necessary evaluation 3 times. The pharmacy company that supplied the fraudulent treatments was already distancing themselves, already releasing statements about no knowledge of his actions, the kind of statements that mean nothing and everything simultaneously." By 1700, Pierce walked out of the hospital carrying a box of personal items, and news cameras were waiting like they'd always known he was coming. His phone rang continuously, journalists, the medical board, colleagues suddenly becoming very busy. By evening, his name was trending on 3 platforms. Medical ethics professors were using his case in lectures. Within 3 days, his medical license was suspended. Within a week, his malpractice insurance dropped him, his phone had stopped ringing, and his name had become the kind of cautionary tale that gets told in hospital break rooms for years. 6 months later, the morning light came through the pediatric ward windows at a different angle, the way light moves when seasons change and the story underneath also changes. Laura stood in Emma Hartley's room in her scrubs, though now the captain's insignia hung on her personal effects, visible to everyone, and no one called her just a nurse anymore. Emma sat on the bed, 9 years old, the bandage still fresh around her head from the cochlear implant surgery. The surgery that Pierce had deemed unnecessary. The surgery that had become possible only because fraud had been exposed. Amanda activated the external processor, and Emma's eyes went wide, the way eyes go wide when sound touches your brain for the first time in 8 months, when the world suddenly comes with a soundtrack. Through the window, Laura watched a figure approach the hospital entrance, Colonel James Hartley, back from Bagram, moving with the controlled urgency of a father who'd been gone too long. Emma saw him and didn't hesitate. She didn't wait. She ran, and when she reached him, she screamed "Daddy," the word clear and bright and possible only because someone had chosen mission over reputation. Hartley dropped to his knees, Emma crashing into his arms, both of them crying. When he looked up, his eyes found Laura immediately, recognition there like a signal fire. He stood, still holding Emma, and rendered a salute. Laura returned it. Amanda approached with tears streaming, the insurance paperwork in her hands. The refunds. The coverage for therapy. The estimate that the investigation Laura started had identified fraud at all 12 facilities where Pierce had worked, saving the Department of Defense $40 million. Through the window, in the parking lot, a familiar figure loaded boxes into a medical supply van. No longer Dr. Pierce. Just Marcus Pierce, delivery driver, wearing a company polo shirt, his old parking spot, the one marked head of pediatrics, now belonging to someone else. He moved with the careful precision of someone who understood that his life had compressed into smaller and smaller spaces until there was barely room to stand. Sarah, the new graduate nurse, approached Laura in the corridor. "They're offering you the director of nursing position," she said. "Vance is retiring next month." Laura shook her head, watching Emma laugh at something her father had just said, the sound clear enough to reach her through the glass. "I'm Army. I have 2 more facilities to investigate." She turned to leave, then paused, the way she always paused before speaking something true. "Tell them this though, power is not a title. Power is the ability to help." She walked toward the exit, past the disciplinary board where her write-up had once hung, now replaced with a commendation and a photograph of Captain Laura Bennett, decorated soldier, Nightingale 6, the quiet person in the room who'd been holding everything together all along. Behind her, Emma Hartley laughed again, the sound of a child who could hear her father's voice for the first time since the virus had taken it. Everything was different now. Everything had been waiting for someone brave enough to stop being quiet. If this story moved you, if you believe in people who sacrifice their own protection for the truth, hit subscribe. Hit like. And comment below, have you ever worked alongside someone whose true strength was completely invisible until the moment it wasn't? Because those people exist. They walk among us. And sometimes they're wearing scrubs.